question I'll give from one of our sponsors. And I believe the question is Kishimoto first? Yes. The question is, what are the biggest issues in special education that face the Assembly in California, and how would you address them?
Thank you very much for the question. So I'd like to bring up two issues. One is really the challenge of can the state take a more systemic and smarter approach to addressing special education. And I think the most important approach there is early evaluation and intervention. And this is something that would result in both more impact, more effectiveness, as well as hopefully save money over the long term. So in order to do that, we need to fund teacher training so that all teachers, both in preschool and regular school, are fully qualified to detect the need for evaluation, and also fund county regional system centers so that they can support the schools and teachers in effectively supporting these students. And we also need more effective ways of reaching the preschool children so that we can identify and begin addressing their needs so that they're fully prepared, as prepared as they can be to start school. And one source for funding for this is, because it is something that may cost money, maybe a proposed legislation that is coming from Senator Simitian. I think it's AB 656, which would move up the kindergarten date. And this is something that would bring in $300 million a year to preschool education. And I'm envisioning that this is some part of that funding could be dedicated to this. The other one, which I'll mention quickly, is funding. The special education is a congressional mandate. They've committed to funding 40%, but in reality, I know in Palo-Alto numbers, they fund only 10%. So it's important that the state work with the federal government for full funding.
Thank you. Mr. Becker.
Well, I'm very concerned about the growth of students identified with special needs, including autism spectrum disorders. The numbers that we hear now are 1 in 100 for kids, 1 in 60 for boys, are some of the numbers that we're hearing now. My own brother-in-law is autistic, and I'm very proud to work with Autism Speaks and work with funding research at Stanford right now into what is causing this. I mean, we can't, our school is not prepared for this influx of kids, and we have to figure out what's going on. And I'm very concerned about, ultimately this comes down to funding. And I'm very concerned right now that because of the lack of funding from the state, that we're now pitting parents of special needs kids against parents of non-special needs kids. And I think that's a really unhealthy dynamic. And it does come back to funding. As Yoriko pointed out, the federal government is supposed to fund 40% of our special education needs. They've never funded more than 19% at a state level. But the state has some responsibility for this as well. Every time they give us additional money, we use it for something else. In Arnold's current budget, he requested $1 billion more from the federal government for special education. And that same budget, he uses that $1 billion for something else. And it's not just Arnold. Gray Davis did the same thing. We got additional money in, about $250 million, and used it for something else. So ultimately this comes down to funding, and it comes down to honest budgeting in Sacramento so that we can get the money that we need here for our schools.
Mr. Gordon.
The question was what issues face the Assembly in California as it would relate to special ed. I think one, to begin with, is an issue that comes from what's called Assembly Bill 3632. This is a piece of legislation passed in the mid-'80s that required a shift from school districts to county governments for the provision of mental health services to special ed students. What's happening around the state is that county governments, given their cash-strapped basis, are pulling back on the funding that they're making available under AB 3632, and therefore squeezing the special education program in a way, particularly for those students who need mental health services. The State Assembly needs to address this question, and it needs to fully fund the mental health services that it guaranteed under AB 3632 to be provided by local county governments. I also would agree that we need to work to get additional federal funding and get the federal government to meet its commitment to special education. And in that regard, I think that the Assembly ought to develop a delegation that takes on as a goal and mission to be in Washington on a regular basis to advocate and get us that money. I also think another issue that the Assembly needs to address in relationship to special education is the impact that special education may have on a smaller school district. All it takes in a small school district is 4 or 5 students with very severe needs for that school district to end up having some financial difficulties. Children with the most severe needs, that funding ought to come from, I think, a separate system funded by the state of California. It's an issue I believe that the State Assembly should address.
Thank you.